Hey, what's happening? Welcome back. Hey, have you ever thought about what's going to happen when you die? You know, I hate to get morbid on you, but you are going to die at some point. When you die, your body's going to be placed somewhere. Have you ever thought about where your body would be placed? Maybe it would be something as cool as this. Or maybe that's a little extreme. But what would you want on your gravestone? What would you want on your epitaph? What would you want to be written about you? How do you want to be remembered? This is a question that many people throughout history will try to answer. Who am I and how will I be remembered? Let's look at one example from the ancient world of an epitaph from a person. The writing on the tomb we just looked at says this: "Mortal, here I lie, Kurush, king of kings. Grudge me not, therefore, at this monument." Whew! When I die, I hope I have something that baller on my tombstone. Yeah, you can kind of assume that whoever this Kurush guy was pretty powerful. I don't think people just throw around the term king of kings very lightly. You know what that means? The king above all kings. Kurush must have had some serious power. And he did. In fact, the Greeks called him by a different name. They called him Cyrus the Great. He was the first king of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, maybe the most powerful of the ancient world. Persian leaders were referred to as the Shahanshah, or in English, the King of Kings, and they're often portrayed in all of their glory, treated almost as if they're gods, with power completely unparalleled. These Persian kings were believed to be almost immortal. They were believed to be supernatural and to have all power over all things, not just other kings, but over the world itself. This is an unprecedented amount of power, and it's a new type of state that we're going to see in the ancient world. We're going to unpack that and more today. Hit it. So in our last episode, we left off talking about the greatness of Babylon and Sumer, the early city-states and empires of Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent and the cradle of civilization. They had discovered farming in the river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates and set a new standard for organization and functionality of states. And all was well until the Assyrians showed up. Known as lovers of war, the Assyrians arrived in the Fertile Crescent in about 1100 BC, specifically around the Tigris River. The Assyrians brought a new level of warfare into the world. They capitalized on the iron working that the Hittites had pioneered and introduced new techniques, armor, weapons, and even siege weapons to allow them to get over walls. For almost 500 years, the Assyrians held the title of the most fearsome warriors in all of the world. And the ensuing empire dominated the Fertile Crescent. The Assyrians did have a strict and organized society, similar to what the Babylonians and Sumerians had established long before them. But let's be honest, we recognize the Assyrians for their brutal tactics and success in warfare. They're even mentioned in the Bible, conquering the Israelites at one point. More on that later. And yet, as savage as they seem, they did invent the world's first library. Allegedly. The Assyrians were so wrapped up in war because it was tied to their worldview and beliefs. They believed in a god called Assur. And they believed that this god had to be pleased at all costs through conquest and violence. It was a part of their nature. But much like the Sumerians and Babylonians before them, the Assyrians wouldn't last either. It's probably because they were too focused on warfare and nothing else. In 612 BC, when the Assyrian king Assurbanipal died, a new empire would take over. Well, it's actually not that new. They're back. Babylon round 2. Under the leadership of the king Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians reemerged in a new empire called the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which basically means the New Babylonian Empire. The Neo-Babylonian Empire would expand to new heights, truly becoming an empire, not just the city-states that it once was. Nebuchadnezzar specifically rebuilt the city of Babylon with new canals, roadways, and buildings meant to really glorify himself. In fact, like many rulers, he really does kind of love himself. This is the same Nebuchadnezzar who, in the Bible, builds a massive gold statue of himself and has everybody every day worship it. Or if you follow the VeggieTales version, a giant chocolate bunny. Your choice. Nebuchadnezzar's impact on world history is clear. He sets a new precedent for the power that one person can have. And he liked to show it off quite a bit. Best example of this was when Nebuchadnezzar married his wife, who was from a foreign land. In order to make her feel less homesick, he built her this. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon combined waterfalls with vegetation from all over the world in order to comfort Nebuchadnezzar's wife. Guys, hope you're taking notes. If you want to get the girl, build her a garden. 100% of the time, it works every time. But while Nebuchadnezzar expanded the borders of the Neo-Babylonian Empire further than they ever had before, his time was temporary too. And you could say that the writing on the wall foretold the end of the Babylonian dynasty. Literally. During a party in the court of King Belshazzar, a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, a mysterious hand appeared and wrote Hebrew letters on the wall. Daniel, who like many of the other Israelites was living under occupation during this time, was summoned, and he read the writing on the wall, which basically foretold the collapse of the Babylonians, that a group would come in and destroy them. Hey, would you look at that? History confirms the Bible confirms history yet again. Just as Daniel foretold, a group called the Medes would invade Babylon and take over this empire. We know the Medes better as the Persians, and they were led by the leader Kurush, Cyrus the Great, who, as we discussed, will become known as the King of Kings. Very quickly, Persia created one of the largest empires the world has ever seen, stretching from modern-day India all the way to the Mediterranean Ocean. And this empire was so big that Cyrus and his descendants would divide it up into smaller, more manageable states, which they called satraps. Satraps were governed by individual governors that reported back to the king. So quite literally, Cyrus and his descendants would be kings of kings. They are kings ruling over kings. But this title encompasses so much more. Cyrus was truly all-powerful. And this is a trend that would continue for all of the Persian monarchs to follow. This included the famed Darius I, who would expand Persian power to its height, even invading Greece in the Persian Wars. More on that later. The Persian kings of kings were viewed basically as gods, completely powerful and in control of all things. They even believed they had control of the universe because they were representatives of the gods. There's one specific story that illustrates this very well, and I just happen to love it. We'll talk more about the Persian Wars with Greece in Unit 2. But within that context, the Persian king Xerxes is attempting to build a bridge across water to invade Greece. And the weather wasn't exactly cooperating. And Xerxes, this king of kings, whom the seas and the land should bow down to, was so frustrated that he ordered that the water in front of him be whipped by his soldiers. You heard that right. He had the sea punished with a brutal whipping. Guess how well that worked for him. But it just shows you the context for what we're talking about when we discuss these leaders. And yet in many ways it's surprising that both Cyrus and Darius and many of these other Persian kings were very tolerant of other religions. Maybe it was because of the massive diversity in the Persian Empire. Maybe it was because the kings of kings knew who was actually in power. And they knew because of how successful and feared they were that people were going to follow them. Much of this was due to their military success. Persia's army was better organized than most in the ancient world, and because of that, their elite soldiers became known as the Immortals, because they simply couldn't be killed by their enemies. It's safe to say between the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Persians are the most successful and the longest lasting, and probably the most impactful on our world today. Their military organization, as well as their precedent for religious tolerance, is something that will be copied by many empires to come. And the Persians also changed the way in which an economy works. To better understand this, you have to go back to how the economy used to work. If you wanted something, you traded for it. So let's say my buddy over there has a very nice cow. If I can acquire that cow, I can feed my family for potentially a whole year. Not to mention I get leather and milk and all sorts of stuff from it. But the cow's not mine. So I have to find a way to convince my buddy over there to give me his cow. Well, how can I do that? I give him something of equal value. So maybe it turns out that I'm a basket weaver. That's what I do. And so I offer to my buddy a basket in exchange for his cow. We probably both recognize that one basket is not equal to a cow. So maybe it ends up being 50 baskets. And if he likes the trade, great, we have a deal. The problem with this is value is not clearly defined. And when you want to trade, it's not always feasible or easy to carry a cow around with you. Imagine walking into Best Buy and trying to buy a new flat screen TV and paying for it by throwing down a cow on the desk. That's not going to work for you. The Persians changed all that. Under Darius I, the Persians introduced a system of metal coinage or metal currency in which coins could be exchanged for whatever you wanted to buy. This system of a money economy will become the predominant force of exchange in the world through the rest of history. And I think we're all pretty thankful for that. So the Persians were game changers when it comes to world history. And maybe most interestingly, their worldview was pretty different from most people at that time. See, the Persians were monotheistic, or they believed in one god, but it wasn't our god. They believed in something called Zoroastrianism. It's a very interesting religion that believed in a god named Ahura Mazda and had some similar beliefs to Christianity, like the presence of good and evil, heaven and hell, and all of that. But it is different, especially when you circle back to this King of Kings thing. Yes, the Persians were extremely powerful. And yes, their power and their empire was unparalleled within their time. But King of Kings is a lofty claim. For one person to control everything? Well, that's impossible. But there is a King of Kings. The Persians were just looking in the wrong place for it. And they were looking at the wrong type of ruler. You see, the King of Kings that I know was nothing like that. He wasn't militaristic. He wasn't power hungry. The King of Kings I know was a baby born in a stable. And that baby would grow up to die for the sins of the world. And from then on, yes, now he rules as King of all kings. Here's what the Bible has to say about this. See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted. Just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of a human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. So he will sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, and what they have not heard, they will understand. Oh, sorry, just looking for that mic I just dropped. The Bible leaves no doubt of who the King of Kings is, and again, what he did for you. Pretty incredible when you think about it. And once again, the point of all of history. The Persians were close, but not close enough. And the Persians won't be the only ones who have this sort of belief about themselves and the power that they have. But that's a story for another day. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.